So hello everyone as you're entering. Just one more minute and then we will begin. It's lovely to see familiar and unfamiliar faces, including people traveling, people in the dark, people who are just initials.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you all. I must say, I kind of desperately to say hello to all the people I know and the people I don't know. But when I'm smiling at you.
Yes, we can all feel special as if you're smiling at each of us individually. Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started. Let's get started. I think as the part I'm doing is the least important part of the day. So I'm hello, everyone, and welcome as you're arriving. I'm Simon Ellis. I'm a artist scholar here at the Centre for Dance Research, University of Coventry, and together with Lily Hayward-Smith, we curate this series of conversations called C-DaRE Invites. What you hear here today is the last of Series 3. This is the last of 4 conversations for Series 3, the body and land. It evolved, I guess, out of this idea that as animals, we evolved to be in and of the land, that our nervous systems function best and are made to be in the land. And this series has responded to this fact and the way in which the land permeates the practices and thinking of artists and scholars. And I'm just going to quote Wendell Berry here. If you haven't ever read any Wendell Berry, I strongly recommend him to you. He says, in this state of total consumerism, which is to say a state of helpless dependence on things and services and ideas and motives, that we have forgotten how to provide ourselves. All meaningful contact between ourselves and the earth is broken. So this final session today is with Rosemary Lee and Simon Whitehead. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. They're going to talk. They're going to be in conversation for about an hour, or just under an hour, until midday UK time. And then we'll have a more open conversation with you all. It might be that I ask a couple of questions in the kind of transition period, but we'll just see how things are going. The conversation is being recorded, so of course, if you don't want to appear on the screen, then please turn your cameras off. And actually, I'm just going to put this in the chat. The recording of this session will go online at this website in a couple of weeks. So if you have people that you'd like to recommend it to or share it with, then that's the site to go to. We won't have a pause or any specific sort of body pause after an hour, but feel free at any time just to come and go. You don't need to, don't need to worry about that. So today, Rosemary Lee and Simon Whitehead talking about landings. Simon is a movement artist based in rural Wales. His practices, I'm going to have to say this word, improvisatory, and he makes work that moves in correspondence with land, materials, and beings. He's recently completed a PhD, a practice research PhD at the University of Glasgow, exploring ecologies of touch and effect, and which I had a tremendous pleasure of being involved in a very small way. He is also a craniosacral therapist. And Rosemary Lee. Rosie is a choreographer and filmmaker working in a variety of contexts and media, including large-scale site-specific works with cross-generational casts and video installations. Her interest is in both portrait and landscape and the relationship between the two. And Rosie is also an associate professor here at C-DaRE, Coventry University. So Simon and Rosie, it's just a tremendous pleasure for us to welcome you here. And we're very much, I'm sure I can say on behalf of everyone here, we're very much looking forward to your conversation. So over to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, Rosie.
Hello, Simon.
Interesting, the camera's shifted and we're now facing each other.
Yeah.
And on my right-hand side, I can see the other people who are present. So welcome. And it's good to be here. Shall I go into this? Yeah. So Rosie and I just had a few conversations before today around how we might approach this conversation. And the first thing we talked about, and I think perhaps I kind of introduced was this this orientation to this kind of virtual medium, which is obviously a wonderful tool, allows us to be together in particular ways and share, but it also brings complexities in terms of our own relationship to the medium. I think certainly for me, I find it quite a nervous medium in terms of being able to connect with people and see and feel people's responses across time and space. So we decided that we might start with a very brief, short kind of visualization that can bring us together in a kind of embodied way, in a kind of a constellation of where we happen to be amongst the landscape and with each other. So I think if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn the camera off and just talk us through it, and then I'll turn the camera back on. Yeah. Okay. Is that, yeah. So yeah, the invitation is to turn your cameras off. So I'd just like to start with this orientation that we're all together within a kind of bodies of land, wherever we happen to be. And the first thing I'm going to invite is just an orientation to touch, as feeling the kind of the ground beneath your feet, and feeling the ground is kind of feeling you, perhaps the seat that you're sitting on. I'm just going to put my hands on the table in front of me, so I kind of just really orientating through touch to kind of where I am right now, and to introduce the fact that we'll just kind of we'll walk and talk through this, that we're doing this together. So the next thing is just kind of orienting to the room that you're in, kind of visually seeing where you are, your placement in the room amongst other things and objects and materials and light and shade. And coming back to touch and just kind of inviting you to bring your hands together and just feeling the relative temperature of the hands and the surface of the skin with each other. And just taking a little bit of time to feel the touch of one hand within the other. This kind of complexity in a way of touching itself, one hand touching another, feeling the relative warmth and coolness of the hands and the fingers. My fingers are quite cool and my palms are quite warm at the moment. And while we're doing that, at the same time, just kind of feeling the touch of the hands, I just want to invite you to take your attention outwards to the edge of the room and slowly out to the horizon where you are. Now, for some people, if there's a window, this might be a visual thing. For others, it might be an imaginary thing that actually, perhaps wherever you are, you have a sense of what the horizon is outside of your building. So we're taking our orientation out into the land, the proximal land where we are, out towards the edges of what we might feel or see or know where we are. And that sense that we have these kind of satellites of wherever we are in the world, of taking our attention out, holding the horizon, feeling ourselves within it three-dimensionally, to the front, to the side, to the back and above our heads, creating almost this kind of architecture that moves with us. And also just bringing into our awareness that these landscape horizons might be interlocking with others who actually may be in the same town or village or place close by. So we're kind of creating this kind of satellite of horizons that some cross over in each other. And to acknowledge that we're in our rooms in the land, and the orientation is to this felt sense of where we are right now. And I think I'm just going to end that there, just with a kind of sense of where we are and where we may come from.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
We've put our cameras back on, and do
Yeah.
as you wish, listeners. Thank you. That was beautiful. So I'm just going to let you all know how we're going to structure this hour. We have talked before this, and it's always that horrible thing where you think, oh my God, all the good stuff's been talked about. So let's hope we can bring it up again for you. And we have 3 to 4 questions that we're going to ask each other that we've agreed upon and will answer. And also we want to involve you as much as we can in terms of giving you a bit of space to think how that relates to you and your own experience of land and landing. But also just to say that Simon and I have known each other since the 90s. Simon's danced in my work, I've worked in his work, and we've made work together, particularly Calling Tree, which we may reference and we'll describe a little bit later, but just to give you that context. So I think with that, shall we start with the first question, Simon?
Yeah. So Rosie and I have compiled these a few days ago. They shifted a bit, but we're going to alternate in terms of asking each other questions, and then the other one of us will respond as well. So first question, Rosie, is what were your early experiences of land? And how did these experiences inform the way you were and are? And was this land something that in part raised you?
Yes. I love that last question. Yes, I'm going to describe the main landscape that I feel raised me and affected all the work I've made, and a few little other ones. But basically, I grew up in a coastal landscape on the edge of East Anglia, which is the most easterly. I was in the town that is the most easterly point of the British Isles. And that landscape is eroding at times, it's tidal, and it has salt marshes. So I grew up where land and sea meet, and where a horizon, a clean horizon, was always present, with big skies, with sand, with heathland, with marshland, and with this mix of water and land that was constantly changing. So there's a constant flux and change and washing away and building. And I'm going to come back to that, but that feels very important to raising me and to the making of my work, actually. But alongside that coastal landscape was a more domestic landscape of quite a large garden, which we were lucky enough to just live in a town, but with a long garden down to a railway line. And in that garden, my father dug and planted and swore and got messy and got bitten by earwigs and came to dinner with, with the soil in his nails and in the cracks of his skin. And there was something about being in that garden and feeling a kind of akinness and possession of particularly a pear tree where I could get high enough to look over the land. That also, I think, has really shaped me and the relationship between me and land, particularly in terms of soil and cultivation and fruit trees and eating. And lastly, I want to share that every year I moved from this tidal, fluxing landscape of change across England to the north, and each geographic kind of geological change in the landscape was noted by my father as we crossed in the old Morris Minor for 8 hours it took with no motorways. And that change between East Anglia and Lancashire, where we first saw what we called a granny wall, and that was when we first saw a dry stone wall, we thought we might be in granny land. So it was a granny wall. We still call those, our family has that name for dry stone walls, because we went from a kind of sandy place to a stony place, and a place of soot and coal and pollution and coal mines and slag heaps. And somehow that dark Lancastrian landscape I loved as much. And the juxtaposition of the two, I think, was incredibly formative for me. And how have those experiences shaped me, or how have they raised me? I think if we go back to the coast, I think a fear of the sea and a respect for the unknown, and for a fear and respect of elemental change, I think is really different from living somewhere more temperate where you're not seeing change so much. So I felt a sense of both powerlessness, that I couldn't change anything, and that the elements would take me or would take the land. So there was a sense of letting go to flux and flow and the flotsam and jetsam of change that I'm now really grateful for, because I think it kind of helps me embrace ephemerality in both my work and my life, and the impermanence of things. And I think that's kind of why I ended up being a choreographer, because dance is so ephemeral and it's gone in a flash. So I think there's something there that really stayed with me, and something about edges, being on the edge, looking out to the beyond and the unknown across a horizon, and the edge of audience and performance, and the unknownness of a performance and the unknownness of an audience. I think I like standing on that edge. Maybe there's one other thing to say there, that I've got my notes here. Just lastly, maybe, that I think as a child, I feel as children, I'm so lucky that I had the chance to go wild in the garden and just be there until we heard the bell for tea. And that time, the effect of time in those landscapes, both tidal, with this constant cyclical nature of time, but also the sense of being, as a child, having a timelessness to relate to a place and to be very intimate, from the base of a piece of grass to looking out from the pear tree. That intimacy and familiarity with land is something I feel so strongly about, that I think it shaped all the work I make. So I think that's my answer. So how about you, Simon? What about you?
Thanks, Rosie. It's good to hear that. I mean, it's interesting having a conversation with you. We've known each other such a long time, but there's some details there that in a conversation like this, it opens up into different details. So yeah, appreciating that. Yeah, so to respond to that, I guess my early experiences of land were a kind of patchwork in many ways. My parents were of the kind of post-war generation that became more mobile. So my father left kind of post-industrial North Wales in military service and then didn't return. My mother left the wild coast of George Bay in Northumberland and kind of pursued her profession as a speech therapist, which meant that we were kind of mobile. We moved a few times, but the main body of time, I think, that I felt kind of in some way shaped me and still resonates within me, was living in suburban North Leeds as a child from the age of like 5 or 6. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the walk to school, because I was of that generation where walking to school was a thing. And it probably gave a generation of children at that time a certain kind of agency, which I certainly had. And the other thing in terms of kind of placement is that we lived in a kind of suburban estate on the edge of Greenbelt. So my early experience of walking to school from the age of 7 on my own, which is 1.5 miles to school and back, which perhaps is something that's not particularly common now, really gave me a sense early on of a kind of understanding that there was something much bigger outside of the bounds of the house and the garden that was kind of intriguing, gave me a sense of something kind of on the edge of wildness. And I think probably later on, when I walked to my kind of secondary school across Greenbelt, was a sense that this kind of liminal space between home and school was something that was shaping me differently, that it wasn't a social or cultural kind of conditioning, but it gave me a kind of freedom and agency that I just kind of bathed myself in. I was a kind of awkward school goer. I was a kind of school survivor, but there was something about this space between home and school where I kind of found some kind of liberty and agency, which kind of really, I think, you know, the daily walk, which is probably the most walked route of my life, even up to now, between the ages of 7 and 8 and 18. I chose to walk. It was almost kind of 2 miles there, 2 miles back. On a practical level, I saved my bus money and I was able to buy vinyl at the end of the week. On another kind of embodied experiential level, I think what was happening, we looked out onto Greenbelt, the Greenbelt as a kind of, suppose, a kind of post-war strategy to kind of protect the city, but also to protect this sense of a kind of urban, a rural urban wild, was that we were looking out onto land that preceded the city that I was living in. So it was like a kind of walk backwards in time, but also a walk that was full of desire paths and wasn't mapped out in terms of a route, that we would take different routes to school in the mornings. Often I would walk it on my own. Sometimes I would meet friends and walk across it. And it wasn't a sublime landscape, you know, the kind of the Greenbelt kind of thing traditionally post-war in British cities is it's a kind of strange zone in many ways. There's kind of wildness, but there's also detritus. You know, there were kind of discarded mattresses and cars, and but there were also streams and trees and birds, but there were others as well. So I kind of, you know, we looked onto other estates across the Greenbelt, and there were meetings with others of difference that kind of happened. But I think it probably, in many ways, raised me and informed the way I work now. Most of the work I make begins with a walk, or may become a walk itself that is shared with others. And I think maybe to introduce now, before we move on to other questions, a very much sense that the kind of more than human world was something that was moving through me, that I was less and less separate to, that it was a kind of calling me to be there. I had a choice, and I would choose to walk as opposed to get the bus, because what it gave me, and it really gave me this space between the civilizing, socializing influences of home and school. I think it's probably something I still search for now in my work and share with others. And also this notion of being amongst other beings, that the more than the other than human beings that one would encounter in terms of a kind of predominance of other life forms in that space, which really kind of resonates, I think, with my work now. So yeah, I think in part my body was raised there. I feel, if I think about it, I can feel it in my body. I can feel the ups and downs. I can feel like the hills and the hollows and the kind of places where we can meet others is still in my body. The sense of walking a land, the topology of a land that you begin to absorb, like the beat of the land, a kind of rhythm of the land, is that you absorb through the body that's moving through, is still very much something that compels me.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and those limbo edge place I'm curious about. Perhaps we can come back to that. But
I mean, just one last thing on that. I'm just reading a book called, people might be interested, called Outskirts. It's by John Grindrod.
Lift it up a bit.
There.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting take on post-war Britain and the kind of modernist structuring of the city. But what's really beautiful in that is he writes it from the experience of living on the edge of Greenbelt and what that gave him as a child. And what I really enjoy is he talks about the planning laws around post-war being built more on mysticism than they were on any kind of functional sense, and that he perceived the Greenbelt as a superhero that was protecting the city.
Mm.
and protecting the kind of the edges, but also the kind of the other kind of more green bounds of the city. So
That's
yeah,
really interesting. Just to share, when I worked in Milton Keynes and looked um, into the background of the land that I was dancing on or making the work on, I found out that Milton Keynes, of all places, and for those of you not who aren't of the English culture, Milton Keynes has a very particular locale in people's imagination as people make fun of it. I'm not quite sure why, but the cows of Milton Keynes became a thing because anyway, it's a funny thing in the sort of psyche. And Milton Keynes is really green, and it's actually built on a ley line. And the town planners, it's in the 60s. So they were all old hippies, and they built it on ley lines. And the thought that the longest shopping mall in Europe, which now is protected, is built on a ley line, I find really quite strange. So there is something about that period where you're right, where there is a sort of different relationship to imagination and land and planning that I feel we've really lost as capitalism has taken a much greater hold.
I mean,
but we could go off on one here, but
yeah, I think the resonance of green belts is still there in most cities and towns, but it's really contested at the moment in terms of building. So it's a kind of interesting, kind of edgy kind of space.
Yeah. So it was here that we thought we wanted to give you just a moment of time, your people with us in those little squares at the side there, to have a moment to think about the land of your upbringing, or a piece of land, or something about it, whatever it is for you, that might have been very formative for you and how you are now, how the land raised you. Knowing that those will be so different for all of you, but to just give you a little time, perhaps a minute, we'll just count in silence, for you to have your own kind of thought back to the land of your formative years, or a land.
Thanks, Rosie. Kind of left with that sense of intrigue of all those different places that might be emerging in people's memory and imagination. And Rosie and I also talked the other day, kind of placing our experiences in many ways of one of kind of the relative privilege in a way to have those experiences that we did and we've had and continue to have in these geopolitical times, and to kind of bring in to the field that we're in now of thinking about land, the notion of exile and the notion of forced exile and the notion of the huge body of people at the moment who are on the move, the necessity of that and what that raises in terms of relationships to land, as a place just to kind of contemplate that for a moment. Thinking a little bit about what John Berger talked about being in exile from one's land, that what remains of one's land is one's body, and how that land has shaped it, and that in a way one can carry the memory of the land with you, but that at the same time there's a fracture. There's an ancestral line that's broken. So yeah, that kind of, just to kind of bring that into the fold right now, and maybe another kind of bit of time alongside our own early experiences of land and how it shaped us, to kind of just bring that into our thinking right now.
And it's interesting that the term landless, that migrants are sometimes described as landless, people as being landless, is kind of interesting how much the language of the word land, which I think we'll come to. Simon, it's already 11:30, so I was thinking I was going to talk about Tottenham, but I think we could move on to the next question, don't you? And that can come up later. Do you think?
Yeah, and we perhaps after the next question we can segue into Calling Tree.
Calling Tree, yeah. Oh, it's me. It's me asking it. So what does land, or the verb landing, mean to you? And once you and I have answered that, perhaps what we wanted to do was offer a poetic text or a poetic moment from the work Calling Tree that might evoke something of this notion of landing. But first to answer, what does land or landing mean to you?
Yeah. So I suppose this comes partly from our conversation around land, and land as a verb, which moves into landing. A sense that the land that we are in and that we inhabit is always in a process of huge change, both geologically, politically, on a sensate level. So the dynamism of land, that it's always going, and that we're always kind of trying to follow the curve of the change, learn ways to adapt. So kind of bringing in that notion, I think, particularly as dance and movement artists, about how we relate to movement and the motility of our experience in land. For me, thinking about landing, it feels to me like a continuum. So the notion of landing somewhere, or I'm being landed, for me is a kind of misnomer. I don't think I ever really land, and I'm wondering if we ever do. And so this notion that landing describes a process of coming into land that we are constantly doing, that might be engendered through different activities that we do. Thinking about our dance practices and somatic practices that we have this relationship to, I wonder in many ways as dancers that this is one of the things that we're kind of always doing through our practice. There's this notion that we're movers on an earth that is always moving, and the orientation to that takes us outside of this notion that perhaps to be landed is edging onto this essentialist notion that kind of some people have landed and others haven't, or some people belong here and others don't, which is a kind of dynamic and an edge that is constantly getting played out, and particularly now. So to think of this continuum for me, this kind of process of landing, is something that I kind of embrace and try to work with in my work. I'm also where I live in rural West Wales here, there's a really kind of vibrant growers community of horticulturalists and growers who kind of rocked up here in the 60s and 70s and created this kind of patchwork with local indigenous farmers of different ways of being with the land. And it's a kind of process in many ways of resistance. Small growers, you're working through permaculture principles, where the notion that new things are always cropping up and showing themselves along the edge. And there's an interesting patchwork here now, really, of a sense of people who are landing through their growing process, and kind of creating these relationships across cultures of the kind of local Welsh indigenous culture that's been here kind of for many generations, and people who are bringing in new practices. There's a quote that we talked about, Rosie, that I thought I might read, which is from Bruno Latour and his book Down to Earth in 2018, where he talks about landing. And Latour, in the last years of his life, talked about landing a lot in terms of a kind of futurism, I think, and in terms of a proposal that is anti-capitalist, that is counter to this notion that capitalism is kind of out of this world. It's kind of constantly telling us that this isn't enough. So what he says is there's nothing more innovative, nothing more present, subtle, technical and artificial, nothing more creative, nothing more contemporary than to negotiate landing on some ground. So the complexity of landing as well, you know, we're landing amongst other beings, we're landing amongst others, we're landing in contexts that have different geologies and climates, and that, so, you know, how do we do that? And I think that is what Latour talked. He never proposes what that might be, but I think there's something about a relationship to soil and where we are, and to understand that that there is actually no great outside, that are always in the land. And you know, that kind of fracture that we have culturally about to want from want of kind of using, not wanting to use this word, of our relationship with the complexity of what nature might be perceived as, yeah, is this, again, this this notion that landing is where we are. How do we land where we are? And where we are, you know, might be mobile, it might be moving around, but it's this kind of process of homing, making home, making land, and knowing that land also inhabits us.
Thank you. Oh God, it's such a hard question. Actually, I just, you know, I wrote a lot on my, I don't know, you can look on my landing page. Let me see if I can be quite specific and this sort of give some specific examples for me of landing, different ways of landing in my own work, I think. So the first thing I always do with anyone, whether they're professional or non-professional and of any age, is to walk and to stand wherever they are. And I'm sure that's something to do with my own need to land wherever I am teaching, whoever I have found myself with, both people, landing with the people in the community, as well as landing on the earth that I'm on at that particular time. And somehow my desire to help everyone in the room or the space the outdoor space I'm with, land as well in this moment here and now. So it's a landing both in time and a landing in space. And I can't separate time out of this talking about land. It's always there, isn't it? Just this notion of the way we perceive or inhabit time, which doesn't exist. But anyway, so a sense of grounding, a sense of finding one's feet. All these lovely proverbs are to do with feeling our feet on the ground. So I'm always go through this physical somatic practice of feet on the ground, feeling the lines of gravity, softening the feet, feeling the earth, in order to help people land in their own way, in their own bodies. And I'm just going to give a tiny example of that, because I sometimes think, should I be doing this, you know, with everyone? And I had a group of 6 elders in a woodland when I was making orchard portraits. And the actual end product only had 5 elders, because Julie died during the process of making it through COVID. And Julie was the oldest. She was 80, and she was an amazing woman. And she had mobility issues and wore glasses that kept changing their darkness, I noticed. So I knew her vision was affecting her mobility. And I remember just doing lots of grounding work, feet on the ground, and just watching in the process of 1 hour how she could walk again and how she could take her glasses off and walk because of the connection to the earth. So there's the body being grounded is just so remarkable. It just allows so much more possibility. But I also know that we're not landing as well on some level, on the levels that you discussed. And then the second thing I wanted to say, because I agree with everything you said, but just another thing, 2 other things, is that if I'm making work, I actually almost hypocritically, I would say, that I need to land not in a space or a particular time in order to have any ideas. And it feels like I need to land in that limbo space that I almost felt in the green belt when you were describing it, that I have to land somewhere in the realm of the imagination and metaphor in order to allow myself to feel free enough to disassociate with the physical and kind of be somewhere in the world, in the land of imagination. We say the land of Nod, don't we? We use the term the land for the land of imaginary places as well. So oddly, there's a landing in a space that I can't describe that is allowing my imagination to flow in some way. So there's these two things that have to happen. And lastly, I'm curious about the word land and the word stand. And I haven't had time to really look into this. Google AI tells me there is a link, but I don't believe it. I think that I'd need to. So I'm just saying I don't know the etymology, but I'm going to say poetically that stand and land might have a root together. And the bipedalism of standing for those of us that can stand, but it's the same for those that are in chairs, or it's that connection downwards to the uprightness of our stance, our being, the uprightness, the verticality of our bodies on the land, that is possibly the most beautiful thing for me when I'm making work. And I think something about us being able to stand on the earth and be upright in it is a remarkable gift for our eyes to scan the horizon. So I'm very aware of that when I watch dancers in a dance workshop. And I think maybe that could, I'm just thinking, is there anything else I want to say? No, there's lots more, but I think that's enough. But that could lead us to landing in Calling Tree a bit, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm just going to jump in, and this is your, as requested, this is your 15-minute warning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Maybe, can I just very quickly say something about Calling Tree, Simon?
Yeah.
And then you add in. So Calling Tree was a piece that Simon and I made in 2014 and then again in 2016, where the performance inhabit the canopy and the surrounds of a significant tree or significant trees, both on a village green and in two parks in London. And in that sense, Simon and I had to land our work there in a public space that has so much history, and the community around that, and the community's relationship to that public space. So in so many ways, we're kind of having to negotiate landing into a community, into people that care or don't care about that space, into a place where people feel they own it, where many histories have happened and futures will be, and it also into the life of that tree. So there are many landings going on with making that work, aren't there? And I just felt like I wanted to share that.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think, again, it was an itinerant piece. So we identified, as you said, kind of trees in different communities, kind of sentinel trees, I suppose, that were perhaps kind of just from visiting those places seemed quite significant to us, but maybe also other people shared them with us. And this notion really of actually making something in a public space that was transparently being made over some places over a number of seasons, but also in London over a number of weeks prior to the performance, for me was the kind of, there was something about that of the process being witnessed by the public, but also attenuating to a tree or a series of trees through artists who are confident at height and climbing, but very much a sense of an opportunity that gave people to spend some time with trees that were there, and the kind of life forms in that. So there's a lot around bird life as well. The tree in Tottenham had some jackdaws,
Had nesting woodpeckers,
and yeah, nesting in the tree. So amongst the performers, these were these kind of comings and goings. So there was a kind of complexity there of this kind of ecosystem, as well as the kind of social space, I think, that we're making in, and in many ways being led by that, and also led by the kind of the structure of the tree into where the performers would situate themselves, and thinking about time as well, that time really stretched, that we felt that a kind of theatrical time felt a bit counter to those spaces. So sometimes the work would happen over a day, and it would happen in episodes.
8 hours was our longest, and 5 hours was this minimum, I think. And we had the word habitation, didn't we, which really links to land, I think, and dwelling and abiding. And we had this sense that we wanted the audience to land and be with us rather than watch a display, but actually inhabit the space with the tree. And it's reminding me of you talking about your walk and across the green belt and how you felt, and that change in you, in sort of how you've felt in relationship to time and space, and how we also were kind of wanting that in the audience. And it reminds me too of my childhood and of the pear tree and sitting in the pear tree. I'd never made those two connections before today, but you know, those roots, those threads back through our childhood to what we make, they're always there. You just don't always see them or find them.
I'm aware that, you know, as that thinking about time, that our time in this conversation is kind of getting close. And there are a few other things, but I think within that, there is something about this cultivation of love of a place, which I think, you know, was in there. And also kind of talking to people about their kind of experience of those trees within those places, which kind of touched on this kind of sense of love and care, which makes me think a little bit about how one, in order to care for a place, one needs to kind of cultivate relationships and a kind of love of, in order to care, in order to kind of look after in some ways. And for us, particularly in light of, you know, because at the time there were all these kind of events happening around the country of, you know, remember in Sheffield that that there was huge cuttings of mature trees through cities in order to clear land for building, and that there was a kind of sense of partly of a kind of resistance in this, of spending time with, of cultivating these relationships, and also kind of really tapping into a kind of collective sense of stories that people had of these relationships with these beings that they kind of live amongst them. That here, particularly in Tottenham, the tree was like over 500 years old. It had witnessed a lot of changes in that neighborhood.
Do you want to share? We were going to, I missed that out of that question, Simon, sorry, because it was my task to say that we'd like to share one poetic text or poetic moment, and you had that lovely moment. Do you want to share that, and I'll share a text before we move on?
I could do that. I think, you know, when you're making work like that, when you're really absorbed in it, it's sometimes only kind of afterwards and in hindsight that you kind of, there are certain things that really remain with you. I think what in College Tree, what opened up was that there was a sense of the performance happening amongst many other performances in those public spaces and events that were happening. It was a kind of, I think we were trying not to be centralizing this within the landscape, but to kind of be placing it there amongst all the other things that were happening. So what happened one day towards the end of the event, during one of the kind of 6 to 8 hour performances that were happening, is that we noticed the clouds were coming in and there was thunder, and then just as the clouds came over the top of the tree, there was thunder and lightning and torrential rain. So we called the performers down out of the tree, and all the audience and the performers mingled underneath the tree and took shelter beneath the tree. And immediately it just felt like something very old was happening. It wasn't planned. It was just something that humans have done over time, And this was happening in a kind of, in the midst of Tottenham. There were, well, 80, 90 people underneath a tree sheltering together and talking to each other. And any of those kind of edges between performer, audience, whatever, just kind of softened and everyone mingled. And we were there for quite a while, sheltering.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That reminds me that there's of the sense of common land, the past of common land, and the sharing of land within a community that we've lost a bit, and that public parks are the closest thing to that. And yeah, what that park held so many nationalities and languages, didn't it? And there was just it's extraordinary.
And it was 2 days after Brexit.
Oh God, yeah. We had to stop the rehearsal because of it, because we were too upset, and it was too dangerous for them to be crying up in the boughs of the tree. That's what oh yes, I'd forgotten that. So I wanted to share the words of Alessandra Sutin, who was clad in yellow and standing on the lower bough, and we saw her as the oracle of this tree. And her words, she sort of riffed off words around the word stand, which I brought up before. So I'm just going to say some of the things she said, because what we were trying to evoke in the audience was both a sense of resistance, a sense of landing, and also a sense of connection with the tree, both somatic and in imaginative ways. Stand down, stand up, stand in your footprint, stand of trees, stand under, stand still, stand tall, stand softly, hand on heart, I am calling you. So that's just a few of her words I thought I'd just share. And we are running out of time. We have 7 minutes to answer the last question.
What do we need and what is important right now, Rosie?
I watched a TikTok last night when I was just relaxing, and a Chinese woman at Harvard University gives the most beautiful speech. So if anyone can find it, I just was so moved by it. And she talked about celebrating, listening deeply, empathy, and staying soft in hard times. And she talked about seeing humanity as one, as if no sea could separate us, and the land as one. And somehow I just wrote that down because, God, do we need it? But equally, in Wendell Berry's words, whose words we sang out from the tree, but also I've been reading for years, so it's a lovely shared thing with Simon. He does say, where does he say? Oh God, what we need is here. Yeah, what we need is here. And we pray not for new earth or heaven, but to be quiet in heart and in eye clear. What we need is here. And there is something about the locality and everything that we have and the potential we have as human beings, and making acts locally and doing things locally that help nature and help biodiversity and respect the land and encourage stewardship, that is also really important. So for me, it's the combination of local and global.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess my response would be to kind of go to probably a compatriot of Wendell Berry, who's kind of Gary Snyder, which is this proposal, which is, you do your work where you are. Do your work where you are, wherever that might be and wherever that might take you. Well, I kind of feel that. We in our village have kind of developed a small collective over the last 10, 15 years of dance artists and creative producers and writers. And we just culminated this last weekend, the 2-year project on our local rivers, inviting dance artists and sound artists to encounter the river, partly through some of Pauline Oliveris's deep listening practices. So we had finished with a weekend of deep listening with sound and movement, and inviting people to swim in the rivers locally and stand in them and consider them. And it was a kind of celebratory weekend. But one thing that came out of that, which is a practice that I've done since 2006, is spending time in the river, just a walk away from where I live. And this arose when I was working with a collaborator called Barnaby Oliver, who's a sound artist based in Melbourne. 2010, we had a year-long project where we stood in our rivers and made work across time and space. And what we realized over time is when occasionally we would meet around the same time and we would be standing in our rivers, is that we were standing in an unbroken body of water. We were actually standing in the same river. So one of the things I invited this weekend with a group of people from ages 6 or 7 up to into their 70s was come and stand in the river. So we went down to the ford. There were about 30, 40 people there. We stood in the ford.
Great.
We faced downstream. We felt the water running around our legs and the change of temperature. But what I brought in was the orientation that here we are standing in our village in a body of water that enfolds the earth. And this notion, I think, which is really important, is that we land where we are within the consciousness of being on the greater earth. This kind of local, and sometimes there's things that are happening in the local that remind us that we're part of the larger earth. And that's, I think, one of the modalities that as dance and movement artists we can kind of infiltrate into our communities and our relationships. And stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway proposes.
Stay with the trouble. Simon, we're 2 minutes early. There's loads more to say, but I think it's good to stop there, don't you, Simon W?
Yeah, it's good to know when it's over.
Yeah.
Thank you both. It feels I feel a certain amount of sadness because I was just the pleasure of sort of, I guess, watching you and listening to you in flow, and it always that kind of interruption of a slightly arbitrary period of time. It feels a little weird, but I guess maybe this is a chance for I've got some things I'd love to hear more about, and I can ask a couple of things, but just also to give space to everyone else in this platform, I guess, to think about the kinds of things you might like to ask or contribute to the conversation. Now's the time to do that. You're very welcome to either put something in the chat, or you can just raise your virtual hand. Everyone loves raising a virtual hand. Maybe so. Please go ahead. But maybe to sort of transition to that. You started with this question, Simon, about being raised by land. The question of how or were you raised by land, and what would you both say to someone who might answer no to that question, that is, that they were not raised by land? That might be from the perspective of what does it mean to be raised by land, but also the sort of sense of not having that same kind of deep connection that you both spoke of.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I think obviously we're very aware that everyone has different relationships with land and what that might be for them. I guess sometimes land isn't a safe place, and you might want to resist the land having some kind of influence on you if you're not living in a place that offers up different experiences, and maybe also the notion as well that I think socially as well, do you have the agency to kind of have those different experiences of land, and is it actually sometimes something that you're wanting to constantly to escape? But I think that also maybe acknowledges that it has this effect. It always has an effect, but the effect is different for different people's kind of social, economic, political circumstances.
And I'd probably say that we haven't really said place much, but when we talked before, it was we were often saying place, it not land. So place, you know, the environment of, say, a city dweller. I remember talking about environment with a group of students, and it can that little visualization that I gave, you could probably hear the hesitation in the way I gave it, because I've done that in a circle before and realized that it brings up really emotional stuff, particularly for people who've had been the product of a broken marriage. So a lot of people I've found will say, well, I don't know which land to talk to you about, because there are two homes that they were being shipped between. And because I didn't have that experience, I hadn't quite realized how dual those two different formative experiences of place were for those families. And that's not even dealing with war-torn countries. Or so I'm really aware that both Simon and I have a kind of privilege, so I want to say that again, in our upbringings, but I still think that place shapes you. I'm convinced of that in some way, and that you can't separate place from culture. Culture is the interface with place in a way, and with land. So if we widened it out to place more than land, maybe I can answer that a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think also place has that kind of nice ambiguity for me as well.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, I think Tim Ingold said that place doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I like that place is actually something that is always being made. And so we all have these subjective relationships with more or less being an agent in making the places that we exist in, that we live in, this kind of sense of becoming. And I think the circumstances in which people do that are kind of complex and kind of multifaceted.
Yeah, and then there's also land as nation, and the kind of terrible sort of, in my terms, terrible far right kind of sense of what land means in terms of possession. So, you know, there's a whole nother becoming in a different relationship to that word. Oh God, I've opened a can of worms, but of what patriotism is and of what possession is and nation, and, you know, anyway, land of the free, etc.
It's it makes me also the kind of the ambiguities of the word place in relation to being displaced or misplacing, which don't exist in the same way with the word land. We unland, you know, or
landless.
Landless. Yes, yeah. Miranda has a question from the chat, which she's asked me, or just I just read, which is landing a movement that ends in stillness or a movement that continues to move?
I think from my perspective, and this is the kind of interesting thing about this territory, isn't it? That we probably have all slightly different perspectives on it. But for me, I wonder if we ever land, you know, but we might be involved in a process of landing. And I wonder, even when we die and we become part of the soil, you know, the soil continues to kind of change and turn. And so I see it more in a kind of motile kind of perspective, really, that it is a verb, it's continuing, and we're amongst many other kind of life forms and humans that are continuing to kind of do this.
And I think I always have to land in stillness first before, if I'm working and facilitating with people, I always have to find the stillness to, even if that's unreal, because the body is full of motion inside, I do have to go through stillness in order to then move, just personally. And I see that in the bodies of others. So I feel I need to go through that. So I'm not, and I think stillness is really precious, to still the mind somehow. What did Wendell say? Clear the eye and still the heart. Quiet the heart and in eye clear. Yeah, I feel I need to, just physically I need to do that. But landing is definitely in motion as well. And landing in that weird imaginative space where I feel more possibility of coming up with ideas, then I absolutely have to be hovering. And that's moving, isn't it? Treading water or something.
I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? How we experience stillness, and what that is for us. There are all kinds of resonances for that, aren't there? Whether that is also a process of moving towards that, and what are the practices that engender that for us, that we maybe all have different ways.
So a nice, you don't know this, but you've done a beautiful transition into the next question, which is from Paul Pascal. So Paul.
Hey both, thanks for the
Hello,
talk.
Paul.
Hey Rosie.
Hey.
I guess in this conversation, like broadly, like landing has been a kind of positive ideal. Even if landing is never complete or never happens, it's a good thing to kind of embrace or work towards. Or it's felt that way a bit to listen.
Yeah.
And I think Rosie kind of touched on this a bit in terms of, you talked about the kind of maybe necessity of disassociation in the creative process. And that being a kind of way or a moment where landing is avoided or worked against or deferred maybe. And I was wondering if either of you had any more thoughts about like when might landing, like what are the potentials of avoiding landing, or the pleasures of avoiding landing, or not making a place a home, resisting this, if anything comes up for you guys with that.
Actually, can I start, Simon? That's really interesting, because the question we didn't get to was around distance in landscape, in proximity. And I listened to a geographer called George Wiley give a lecture on distance in landscape, and it made me think that a lot of the sort of the world that I guess one of my feet is in, the somatic world of kind of, and the desire for us to reconnect people to nature. And I know I'm saying this with blunt words, but this desire for proximity and desire to be nature, which I've definitely done and still do. We are nature. But as a maker, I have to see it as other, because I'm thinking about the visual experience of the audience. So I find myself really sort of intrigued by John Wiley's kind of argument that actually, no, the whole point of landscape is otherness, and we are different, and to embrace our difference. And yeah, so I feel very, yes, I feel that as well as knowing a place really well in order to make the work there, I also need to have that there in one part of my brain, and the other part of my brain see the possibility to not know it at all, and to imagine what could happen there despite knowing it's past. But somehow that, I hope that helps me do that responsibly. Does that make sense? So I agree. I think this otherness and disassociation is also kind of critical to the act of making something for an audience.
Yeah, I think I can kind of respond to that. I think obviously the kind of imaginal is kind of the kind of world that we probably cross over, and is a place in which we imagine towards realizing our work. I guess the question for me would be like, where does that arise from? What experiences does that arise from? And I'm thinking in my practice, really, it often arises through walking and moving through a place. In the early 90s, I moved from London to a small village in North Wales on the Llŷn Peninsula, and I was an interloper. I was the other in a way, in that sense. And what I found myself doing for the first year I was there is actually literally almost obsessively walking every day as a way to absorb, as a way to kind of place myself in, I guess, in that sense. I remember a local farmer kind of asking me why, God, you're walking so much, what's going on? But it felt like a way of being able to kind of absorb the beat of a place, to kind of understand it, to kind of, as an interloper, as other, to kind of feel it in my body. And it was from that that the imaginal began to emerge. You know, again, it was probably a kind of this kind of place of the interloper, of coming into a new place, of not just standing and looking, which is this kind of classical place of landscape and humans, which was just to kind of enter the frame and to walk and get muddy, get dirty, get awkward, get lost. Actually, to get lost is a strategy I use quite a lot, working on my own and with others, in a kind of benign sense of getting into a place of not knowing and of allowing something else to kind of emerge and appear in that kind of felt space. And I think that's, you know, I tend to walk each day. It is a place where my imagination really kind of rises up and allows me to think about where my work might be going. And certainly now, post PhD, I'm very much in the transition of thinking, walking, imagining what the next stage is. And I think that's probably my age as well. You know, what is this next piece, and what do I need to do to disrupt continuing what I was doing, but kind of find something anew.
Yeah. I just on that disruption. Oh God, I'm just going to try and find a quote that I think might speak to this, Paul, but I'm not going to know if I'm going to find it. Just that nature's a bodger.
I can look, Rosie, for you.
Yeah, Lewis Thomas calls DNA's habit of suddenly mutating out of the blue the wonderful mistake. You can see equally wonderful refusal to stick to the point as characteristic of all living matter. In the inexplicable intricacy of a red currant flower, in the merging of drifting clouds or orchid varieties on the fen, in the milling festivals of swifts and dancing of cranes, in the nightjar's all-enveloping song and house martin's improvisations. This is what Annie Dillard called the world's nourishment, freely giving its soil and sap. So he's sort of saying there's just loads of mess and change and disruption. Nature isn't. Yeah, it allows for otherness and weirdness and queerness, and it's all there. So, yeah.
Just briefly in response to that, I've been doing a kind of research project working with lichen, and I think the lichen is leading me into the next stage of what I'm going to be working on. This kind of notion of slowing down, but also spending time with communities of difference. That lichens are symbiotic. There are 3 to 4, or maybe many more life forms who are kind of collaborating in order to kind of survive over a kind of deep time. They're queer. They are inscrutable. So yeah, for me, there is about kind of learning from others. That's kind of going on.
Great question. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks.
You, as you were talking, I was, and I think I'm riffing on Paul's thinking here as well, which is something about time and experiences of time, and I guess particularly in landing in planes, and also. Actually, I thought, as a little aside, there's a little thing to read, which is from a book about anxiety. It's about a person the particular part who's got a terrible fear of flying, terrible fear, has to drink wine and take Xanax before flying. That would take one look out the window, grip the arm of whoever happened to be seated next to her. Eventually, when her anxiety had battled its way past the Xanax, she would rip off her seatbelt, stand up in the aisle and shout, "Land this plane now, we are about to crash." And so I just think the idea of crash landing as well. But it occurs to me that some of my strongest and strangest experiences have been and this is in direct contrast, Simon, to the way you talked about the human world moving through you at the beginning of the conversation, which is that the strange otherness of landing after a long haul flight in transhemispheric, when the season has changed, and the kind of the strangeness of that kind of landing. And I wonder about sort of temporal experiences, how they sit or might fit in this conversation.
Mm. Mm. I'm feeling jet lag now. I know that feeling so well.
My question jet lagged you. Sorry, Rosie.
No, it's all right. It's
my...
because my son's just arrived and he's jet lagged. So he just said, I feel so out of sorts. And so everything kind of, you're all jiggled, aren't you? But it's good to be jiggled sometimes and to notice the body finding its way again. We're so adaptable, but it's so uncomfortable.
Maybe also it offers up as well in terms of kind of different experiences. I remember landing in Cairns in America in November, having flown from Heathrow in kind of frost and rain, and arriving in Cairns, it was like 40 degrees. And actually my memory of that project over a month is just like this strange dream of temperatures, of being out of temperature, being out of my ecosystem. And it was dreamlike. It was physical and dreamlike. It was both virtual and physical, and awkward and spectral somehow. You're also kind of meeting duck-billed platypus, kind of strange beings that we see in picture books. But
oh my God, how lovely! Love to see a duck-billed platypus.
So yeah, I think about it, and maybe that's also in different ways, as well as landing in a plane somewhere else, of just this constant thing that humans are doing of trying to land somewhere else, and what you need to attenuate to something different. I was having a conversation with an artist grower in Birmingham last year, with the conversations that Polly Hudson and Karen Wood curated, and Joe Kappa talked about working with refugees in Birmingham, and in their growing projects, some of the first things they would do was just encourage people to get their hands in the soil, and to be kind of party to what the soil does, in terms of kind of arriving in a new place. Yeah.
Well, they know that, it's proved, isn't it, now, that the skin is porous and that we are receiving, I can't tell you exactly what they are. Microbes that actually enhance our pleasure and well-being. It's remarkable, isn't it? But I'm still curious about this non-landing and what Paul and Simon have brought up, and that duality of both wanting to help people feel grounded in their bodies and therefore safe in order to then fly, in a sense, to have a route to the kite in a way, and to excel themselves and to come out of a comfort zone. I think comfort zones are really important, but you have to establish it before you can expand it. But also the desire to fly through life, or to hover in places and to flit and to not connect and to observe. And I'm thinking of open space, actually. Paul, have you ever done that practice? I think you've been there, haven't you? No? You can be a butterfly or a bee, or there are all these different ways to be in a space where discussion is happening. And the Improbable Theatre Company do it every year. It's called Devoted and Disgruntled, and people from the arts join together to discuss things that feel pertinent to them at that moment, and little subgroups happen. But you're encouraged not to if you don't want to land, you don't have to. In other words, you can just skirt, and that experience of skirting and hovering and being the butterfly, as well as the bee and the other, I can't remember what the others are, they're all equally respected and valuable and seen as ways of being. And I really love that diversity of existence and experience. Yeah.
Lynn Matthews in the chats asked, have the visual arts of landscape painting informed your work?
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, a lot for me. I know where Lynn lives as well. She lives where some great landscape painters grew up, near Flatford Mill. I'm very envious. where Constable grew up. It was a beautiful valley and landscape that influenced him and others. I think being in East Anglian, you can't fail to see landscape as a canvas. So because the horizon's so present and the land is flat, and the sky is big, and the vertical figure visually is often knits the sky and the land together. It sort of stitches into the landscape, the figure. So certainly for me, I think my work is very cinematic, and definitely I think of portrait and landscape painting when I'm making work. I think it's kind of is there in me, but I do think that's partly because of the landscape I grew up in. How about you, Simon?
I think I was very much, when I moved from London to North Wales, I became very aware of the kind of figure in the landscape, this kind of frame that in many ways kind of created distance. Perhaps that kind of notion of being able to step back and look. But I think I was more interested in kind of trying to disrupt that notion that that through the kind of perceived distance of that, it creates this sense of, particularly the kind of figure in the landscape. The figure's kind of always human, and this notion of the kind of dominant human figure in the landscape was something that, probably not consciously, but certainly over the years, I've kind of felt like there's something else to really kind of pursue in that. I think also kind of currently this notion of kind of distributed agency of the human being, one amongst many beings in the landscape, and how as movers and makers, how do we both perceive, feel, experience that, but also kind of translate that into work. So yeah, I'm kind of very aware of it. I didn't embrace it because I'm not a visual artist, but I felt like as agents, as dancers and movers, that there is another way to kind of represent and imagine that relationship, more complex.
Thanks both, and I'm sort of laughing myself at the unverified external, the strange ways that Microsoft describe different people in this conversation. But the unverified, Susan Sentler has commented, thinking of lichens hovering as landing, the difference, the sameness. Susan, do you want to say anything in addition to that, or are you happy just to leave that?
I'm in a very busy place right now. In a very busy landing. I just remember I was in a workshop that was online with Simon, and you were speaking to your lichens and the study of them. And I remember you were saying in Chinese that they were, if I'm correct, the garments of the world, the garment of the world, and they hover. They don't necessarily completely rest, which I think is extraordinary. And I love that sense of that kind of liminal space, that in between, that is apparent, and yet, and it questions what is a landing. In a kind of physical and a phenomenological sense. Yeah, that's what I was just kind of bringing up. And I kind of like that if we could land that softly all the time, if we could be, what's the word that I'm saying? What Rosie was talking about of, really sensing the ground, that kind of rootedness, but on the flip side, also have that softness to be able, and Steve Paxton speaks about, of course, just that constant buoyancy to be able to respond and to allow the change to happen. Yeah, that's kind of where I was at.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. That's in relation to lichen, I think there's a Chinese saying that lichen is the clothing of the earth, and lichen actually covers 10% of the world's surfaces, and it is often unnoticed, and perhaps that's the reason that it continues to kind of survive. But it's always on the move. It relates to climate change, localized change. It moves towards or away the conditions that it needs, but it moves like millimeters a year, you know, but it's always kind of on the move or disappearing and reappearing. And it doesn't root. So that's kind of interesting, I think, with lichen. It creates a relationship with surface. And it creates a relationship with surface because it takes all its nutrients from the atmosphere and the air. I suppose that enables it to move on. And I think, you know, like in our imagination, all these metaphors are useful, but I wonder how having roots is useful to us as humans, because we're always on the move as well.
Maybe.
So,
yeah.
Oh, please.
Oh no, it's all right. I just think that's interesting because I won't give up rooting because there's something about rooting deeply where you are and also throwing the net wide, you know, like the World Wide Web, you know, that is sort of across a surface, a bit like a lichen, but then there's also digging down deep locally. So I think they're all like incredibly useful metaphors, and maybe the beauty of our consciousness is that we can hold so many of those and be so many of those, and I think that's a gift to being human. And to say also, just to end, that I do believe that imagination is all rooted in nature. It's the source of it. So, but that nature is just so full of diversity. So.
Thank you, Rosie. It's a beautiful way to finish. So just a huge thank you to you both. This conversation of change, of noticing change, about agency, liberty, landing, not landing, the cultivation of love and safety, of being guarded when you describe these sentinel trees of the local, the global, of distance, and of course of lichen. It's just a treat to listen to you both and to have this opportunity to hear you think through language and your practices as well. So thank you to both. Thank you, Lily, for your work and making this happen, and also, of course, thank you to everyone who's come along here this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. There are lots of links. There are lots of links in the chat for things that were discussed, and of course, this is the C-DaRE Invites website, which you can kind of keep an eye on things as they're coming up. So thanks once again, everyone. And perhaps Rosie and Simon and Lily want to stay on after everyone's left, just so we can exit a little bit less suddenly. So see you all.
Thank you
so
for
much.
coming, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you.